thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed developing this presentation. And one of the things that I was aware of is that with the Native Plant Society, there's going to be a wide variance in your expertise. Some people are going to know way more than I know, and some are going to learn a whole lot more than they knew before they came. So I would appreciate that when I get through with the presentation, if you see some glaring inaccuracy, send it to me either through my contact with you, and I'll see about verifying it and correcting, because this is the first time this has been done. I'm going to talk about native plants and wild birds, and the central things that we're going to talk about are why are native plants critical for wild birds? What does a native plant garden teach you? How to create a bird-friendly backyard? And then last, how can we advocate for environmental action? And I'd start by talking about Wake Audubon. Wake Audubon is by far the largest chapter of Audubon in North Carolina, and it's centered in Wake County, but would take people in the neighboring counties that need help and want to participate. We have monthly meetings. We do environmental action projects. We build a chimney swift tower just for chimney swifts because the towers are disappearing. We participate in citizen science, like with the climate watch that we do in January and June. We go on a lot of field trips, and we're always looking for new and exciting things. But one of the most important things that we do is we advocate for the environment. And this year we are advocating with our legislators for clean energy and energy storage. The Heirs Property Act that had to do with equal rights and with preserving natural environments. And we were fairly successful. So let's start. Native plants have co-evolved with the insects and birds that consume them. Sometimes plants develop defenses to prevent their consumption. Insects and birds adjust to this change over time. For example, pokeweed, when the stem turns red, is toxic to humans, but eastern bluebirds and a lot of birds have co-evolved with the pokeweed so they can eat the berry when it ripens. Insects like this monarch caterpillar has co-evolved with the common milkweed. The milkweed is toxic to most consumers, but the monarch has evolved along with the milkweed to be able to keep eating the plant. Monarchs are now toxic to most predators. And you can see that beautiful black, white, and yellow bands. I just love that. And he's on one of the milkweeds, eating it to death so that he can develop enough energy to pupate. It's important to understand that some caterpillars often will feed on one native plant, but need another native plant on which to pupate. And I saw this Luna moth caterpillar on one of my maple trees crawling down. And months later, I saw a male Luna moth landed on the side of my house. And I'd like to think that that was the caterpillar that became the butterfly. But they eat one thing and they develop a chrysalis on another. Birds find a variety of native plants for nutrition during the changing seasons. The native plants attract birds to consume their fruit, nuts, and nectar to aid in seed dispersal and pollination. Here's a northern mockingbird on a beautyberry bush, and he acted like it was his beautyberry bush. You can see that it's a Native American beautyberry by the tightly clustered berries and the broad leaves that are indicative of the native variety. This one is found over near the Bass Lake Boathouse. Birds consume insects that feed on native plants for nutrition, and especially to feed their young during their critical growth period as nestlings. Here's an eastern phoebe. It eats insects all the time, but during the 2-week period that usually you have nestlings, they will give insects to their young so that they grow as fast as possible, because they're very vulnerable and it's a place that gets uncomfortable the more they stay in it. Now, the phoebe eats insects all the time, but a lot of seed-eating birds switch to insects during their nestling time. Here's a white-eyed vireo. He feeds insects to her young for rapid growth in an alder bush. And this nest was right along the trail around Bass Lake. Many other animals benefit from the relationship between native plants and insects and birds, like this eastern box turtle, the band-legged spider, and the fowler's toad. I'd like to talk a little bit about the native plant gardens that I've been responsible for about 10 years. At the Disciples Community Garden at St. Francis United Methodist Church, between right at the corner of Penny and Kildare Farm Road, they granted me a 12-foot by 15-foot native plant garden area. And it was created alongside the individual family plots. And you can see two on the right-hand side, and communal growing areas. Composted manure was added and tilled into the poor clay soil, and a brown-headed nuthatch box and a bee box were installed on a pole with a baffle. A pair of brown-headed nuthatches moved in before we could put the first native plants in the ground, and the nuthatches raised an average of 2 broods each year since. That was pretty remarkable. And one of the things you would want to know about brown-headed nuthatches is that they nest in cavities very early in the year, because another native plant, the house wren, when it arrives in late March, early May, is going to outcompete it for the same spot. So it wants to raise its young before the house wren shows up. And we've been able to get 2 broods per year, one of them in the early summer. And we believe that it's because the youth group at the church with me made 1 plank birdhouses, and we made so many of them. There are birdhouses all over the place on the church campus. So when the house wren shows up, it doesn't try to compete with the nuthatches because it's got its choice of homes. The first plants that made themselves very well known were scarlet bee balm and wild bergamot. They were quickly established in the garden, and they attracted bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. They're also a very aggressive plant, and they spread very quickly. And I have ways to deal with that, which is really a win-win for me. We did a lot of milkweed. We had common milkweed, swamp milkweed, and butterfly weed, which is a milkweed. And one of the things I like about it, it's the only one that's not toxic. Common milkweed grows like crazy with underground rhizomes, and you'll quickly find that it goes where it wants to go. And I have a lot of common milkweed. It's a very hardy plant. Swamp milkweed isn't quite as hardy, but it doesn't spread as easily. And usually it comes up in just about the same spot that was planted years ago. And butterfly weed, I'm always impressed on how tenacious it is, because it often gets crowded out by slightly taller plants, but at the end of the season, it's still there, it's still well. And monarch butterflies are attracted to milkweed in the garden for food and to lay eggs. Their caterpillars feed on the plants too. Full sun plants like black-eyed Susan and purple coneflower flourished in the native plant garden. I particularly like black-eyed Susans because I'm originally from the state of Maryland. And purple coneflowers, after you get them rooted a year or two, are really hardy plants. Have you ever seen a goldenrod hedge? Besides being an important food source in the fall, goldenrod stalks harbor bumblebee larvae in the winter. So if you're driving past the garden, you can see it from Kildare Farm Road. You'll see the remnants of that goldenrod hedge. And probably a lot of you know that goldenrod gets the knock for hay fever, but really has pollen that doesn't easily get airborne and is not near as a problem as giant ragweed. So we got a grant from NC Audubon a year or two later, and community garden volunteers prepared the ground, laid out and planted native plants in 2 areas between the fenced garden entrance and Kildare Farm Road. And the guy on the left with a shovel, that is Larry Diener, the guy that's the project manager for the community garden. There's the head violinist. There's Dewey, a very important Asian that helps us out with some pretty unusual plants. And then there's Bobby Summers. Now, you can see them putting it in the early spring because we still have the communal areas covered with black plastic to keep down weeds until we're ready. So let's see what it looks like in the later summer. It's really starting to root in well. Once again, though, it teaches me things that I didn't know, but I know now. If you got a sharp eye, you can see 2 on either side. You can see a switchgrass plant. And if you know switchgrass, it gets way too large to be in a garden that's kind of confined. So after a year or so, I moved it into the garden and put it in big pots. And then it got so big, I moved it outside the garden into a berm, and it's happy and it can spread as much as it likes. We also have in the background, it's a little hard to see, inkberry. And inkberry did well, but I always felt bad that some of the herbaceous plants that sprouted up so high that they were kind of shielded most of the year. And once again, when I did a restructuring of this part of the garden, I moved the inkberry to the berm, and they've really taken off. They're really full. They produce a lot of berries. One of the nice things about a garden is questions come up while caring for the native plant garden. One of the ones for me would be, I got to omit somebody. Why did the dominant insects on milkweeds vary from year to year? One year it was aphids all over the place. The next year it was not a caterpillars. They pretty well ate all of the milkweed as they came up. And this year it's been milkweed bugs. And you can see the milkweed bugs right now, because it's getting colder, will cluster inside of a milkweed pod. Here's another question, and I'm sure you've all struggled with it with me, is how can like a Joe Pye weed exist with smaller plants like Stokes aster and creeping phlox in a limited space? Do you put them in the middle? Do you put them toward the edge? Do you create a valley? There's all kinds of ways to do it, and any answer would be correct, but the results would vary. How can you design your garden to have native plants that are blooming in each season like the natural environment? These New England asters are so pretty in the fall, but what are you going to do for the early spring blooms, the early summer, the midsummer, the late summer, the early fall, the mid-fall? If you go on walks, I go on a walk every day, you'll always see something blooming except for the dead of winter. And even then you'll find some exotics that'll bloom. So you got to plan out, not just tall to short. You need to plan out which plants are going to be blooming at which part of the season, so that something's there for the insects and the birds that could possibly feed on. And then what's the real differences of ecological value between native plants and an exotic or a cultivar plant? And here is the other berm on the property. We use berms to keep the water flow acceptable across the garden. And on the left, a lot of you would know that's American beautyberry, and the one on the right is Asian beautyberry. There's lots of easy ways to tell them apart, but the question to me would be, what's its value to insects and birds? And I have an additional question in that the beautyberry plants at my house, when they develop berries, the birds eat them up right away. In other words, they're so heavy with berries that the branches lay on the ground. But as soon as the birds find out that the berries are ripe for eating, they start eating them and the branches come back up. And mine are completely gone. But I go places like the one at Bass Lake, and they still got berries all over the place. And I wonder, why is my plant so fastly utilized and others sit for a while? Is it because they haven't fermented, that they're not the right consistency yet? Or is it that I have some birds that know that this plant is valuable, and it's in an island of plants that don't help? This is a good question. What adjustments are necessary for wet soil and shade-loving native plants to thrive? And my answer would be, go find a place that's naturally wet, that has shade, and plant them there. If you try to put them into a sunny garden, you're really asking for a lot of work and a very little return. But then the other question that comes up is, what can be done to mitigate competitive advantages between native plants? For example, I have a lot of wild bergamot, and each year it expands several feet in every direction. And what I do in the fall is dig up the edges into quart and 3-quart sized pots, and I give it away to people, because that keeps my wild bergamot in a particular area. And it also allows me to share native plants with other people. Cardinal flower. This sentence is really important. Native fauna consume native flora. So if you live in my community, there is a herd of deer, partly because 540 is being developed near my house, and a lot of deer have been displaced. So what can be done to counter excessive depredation of native plants? Well, in the native plant garden that I have over at the community garden, it's an 8-foot fence. That works great. But what do you do if you're not putting an 8-foot fence around your house? Well, you can choose some plants that the deer just don't eat. We have a population of rabbits too that do quite a number, and it's interesting what they will eat and won't eat. If you're really got your heart set on one particular native plant that the deer do like, you can spray deer repellent on it. And after a while, they just assume that it's still that stinky plant and they leave it alone. But every once in a while, with heavy rains, you probably have to go back and do a spray again. How do you explain to others the need for leaving dormant plants standing for insects and birds? That's a tough one, isn't it? Because people always equate everything as neat and tidy and really pretty. And it's not always really pretty in the wild. And you know yourselves that there are insects that will overwinter in the stems or down in the leaf litter. Some of the seeds are still available, so they're really valuable. But then the question comes up, what's the right time to remove the dormant plant stems? If you think back to that goldenrod hedge, what I do is I leave it up all winter, but about late April, I'll cut it down to about 1.5 feet, and I'll take the stems that I've harvested and I lay them gently over in a little wooded area, so that if there are still some bumblebee larvae, they still have a chance to escape. There's 2 books that if you haven't read, I really recommend, by Doug Tallamy, Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope. They give really good reasons and encouragement to turn your yard and your community into a native plant oasis to support the local ecosystem. If you read both books, I think you'd be struck by the fact that Nature's Best Hope was such a big step up from the first book. The first book was great. The second book was 10 times better. I really recommend the books. So how can we attract birds to our yards? Nutritious food, cover from predators, clean water source, nesting opportunities, and native plants. Bird baths attract birds to drink and bathe, like this brown thrasher. And it was as simple as an old plant basin. And he just put in fresh water. There's a little bit of dirt on the bottom. That's not a problem. Just keep the water clean. And this brown thrasher really went at it. Here's a graph I borrowed from Doug Tallamy that shows the percentage of non-native plants. As that increases, the replacement potential for a bird living on your property alone goes down, down, down. But notice that if you have something like a lot of native plants in your area, and in my yard and the backyard in particular, it's got a lot of native plants, then there's a really good chance that they'll be able to replace themselves year after year. Successful bird reproduction is directly related to the percentage of native plants in your yard and your community. Once again, caterpillars have evolved with specific plants they eat. You'll find black swallowtail butterflies on dill and parsley. You'll find monarch butterflies on milkweed. If you don't already know, and I bet a lot of you do, if you go to Audubon, I particularly think NC Audubon, and ask, just Google native plant database, they have a searchable
Jim,
database.
I've got what?
I'm sorry, never mind. Sorry.
Okay. Let me try that again. Somebody's got not muted. The cornerstone for creating a welcoming environment in your yard is native plants. And NC Audubon has a searchable database to choose the native plants, over 3,900. So you're saying I have a shady backyard and I live in Cary and I want to attract cardinals and blue jays. It'll link that up for you. It's a really good resource. In addition, it also gives garden supply and nurseries that are known to carry a lot of native plants. And one of the things that we need to do as a group is to create a market for native plants, because the more native plants that are available, the price goes down and more people are putting them out in their garden. Some examples are milkweed bugs on swamp milkweed, and a hair-streaked butterfly on obedient plant, and a wasp on swamp milkweed. Coral honeysuckle attracts hummingbirds. River oats provide seeds in the late summer, is very hardy, by the way, and devil's walking stick produces lots of berries for migrating resident birds. Here's a bumblebee on a coreopsis plant. A silver spot skipper on a zinnia. And yes, I know it's non-native, but it's the only picture I've got is a silver spot. And a bumblebee on a passion flower vine. Winter berries provide berries in the fall and winter. Trumpet vines provide a lot of nectar. And strawberry plants offer seeds. I always like to go back to bee balms. A wild bergamot and scarlet bee balm, they spread very easily and they survive harsh conditions. Plus they attract a lot of different insects and birds. This mockingbird is ready to defend his beauty berries. I have found that when birds find a reliable source and see her year after year, you're going to find that bird back. Hollies provide cover for nests and its berries for food. Magnolias develop seed pods that are consumed by birds in the fall. This beautiful crepe myrtle is an exotic and lacks the wildlife value that native plants provide. They're beautiful. Garden spiders capture insects and provide balance for your yard. Spiders are sensitive to insects. And when I say balance, what I'm talking about is that if you let the natural world be natural around your house, the spider's going to get a bunch of those insects that maybe you don't want. There's a balance. And when you get rid of one thing, you don't know the repercussions along the line. One of my pet peeves is the mosquito companies that come out and fog your yard, and they say they're only killing mosquitoes. That's not possible. A black rat snake will hunt in your yard for rodents, and they're harmless. A copperhead is venomous and should be admired at a distance. If it's left alone, it will also remove rodents from your yard. This was one of 2 copperheads right next to the community garden. And we had a discussion because there were a couple of us working that day, what we should do. And we decided that this property was theirs too. And as long as they stayed away from us, we were okay. And they seemed to be more afraid of us than we were of them. Northern flickers will feed on insects on your lawn, but are sensitive to herbicides and pesticides. Brown thrashers will search for food in your yard's leaf litter. Leaving leaf litter provides important habitat for a wide variety of animals in the winter. A Fowler's toad, like many frogs and toads, will gobble up insects if provided a suitable habitat. And I don't think we see too many Fowlers from where I came, and it's one of my favorite toads now. Birds will find cover in junipers for nesting and roosting. Junipers also provide berries that birds will eat. Common yellowthroats search for insects and will nest in native trees like this black willow. Don't forget the other animals that hide and feed in your yard. An eastern box turtle is feeding on a fallen tomato. And if you really look at him, doesn't he look like he got caught red-handed? Now, here's a little aside. It's what effect does feeding birds have on wild birds? I won't go on too long, but I think it's important. What we should know is that they attract birds to crowded feeding conditions. They offer food that birds don't normally eat, and they can increase the chance of predation. This is a platform feeder of a bird that came down in an eruptive invasion this last winter. They're called pine siskins. They remind you of really streaky looking house finches. So what can we do? Well, how to keep them safer? Number one, keep your feeder clean. Buy quality seed. Quality seed, you get what you pay for. Use easy to clean bird feeders because you want to clean them on a periodic basis. Select bird feeders resistant to squirrels. Provide cover from predators and follow safety warnings about bird diseases. Probably a lot of you heard that there was a disease killing birds in North Carolina. And I Googled it. Of course I did, because a lot of us did. And if it took me to the NC Wildlife Commission, and they said that the amount of disease in birds this year wasn't any greater than any other year in the last couple of years, but in the area where the cicadids came out a little farther north from us, there was a significant disease problem. And what I would say is, if you're not sure what's going on, Google bird disease North Carolina, and it'll take you to a reputable spot, and it'll tell you if you need to take your feeders in, or if it's okay to keep your clean feeders with quality seed out. You know, I had several people during this winter say, well, actually fall, that said, well, my feeders are always clean and my seeds are always clean. But my question would be, have you seen any diseased birds? Because if you do, then your place could be a vector for disease. All those healthy birds could get sick because of the diseased birds coming to your feeder. This is an example. A house finch has a case of conjunctivitis, a highly contagious disease that impairs vision. Crowded conditions at infrequently cleaned feeders are a major contributor to spreading this disease. So here's what you should do. Songbird feeders should be sanitized at least every 2 weeks and more often in wet or humid conditions. That sounds like North Carolina. And wildlife officials advise remove all remaining seed and scrub off any debris. Soak the feeder in a bleach solution of 1 part bleach to 9 parts water for 10 minutes, then dry the feeder completely before refilling. If you're in a big hurry, you can use a hairdryer. Hummingbird feeders are a little bit different. Hummingbird feeders should be sanitized at least once a week and more often in wet and humid conditions. Wildlife officials, they pretty well advise the same thing. Soak the feeder in a 1 to 9 part solution, dry the feeder completely, but they also add, fill it with a solution of sugar water, which is 1 part table sugar to 4 parts water with no added dyes or any form of natural or artificial sweetener. Notice that the ruby-throated hummingbird is sitting on a red feeder, but the liquid is clear. It's attracted to the red at the bottom. It doesn't have to be a red tube. And if you really are big on red, just buy a hummingbird feeder that is a red plastic or a red glass. I recommend glass, by the way. And this gets to the last part. And it's about what we should be concerned about. The natural world is in direct conflict with human activity. We are causing a wide variety of negative pressures on its ecosystem and the quality of life for all living things, like this red-bellied woodpecker. So the next couple slides, not a lot, I'd like to show you some examples that would be of concern. Honeybees. We know that they're essential pollinators for a variety of crops. Honeybee queens, when I used to be a beekeeper, they used to survive an average of 4 to 5 years before needing to be replaced. Now, the average lifespan of a queen is 9 months, and it's generally assumed this is due to environmental degradation. You know, the community garden has beehives, and we've had a heck of a time keeping them healthy. We had a pretty good year this year, but they say, how's that happen? Because we don't use pesticides or herbicides in our garden. We try to be an organic practicing garden. But see, we can't keep it from flying to other areas where they do use it. This is a pretty dramatic picture. It's a friend of mine. This is Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge on the eastern shore of Maryland. And she had taken her red Jeep down to Blackwater because there was a tropical kingbird that you don't see in Maryland hardly at all. Climate change is affecting ecosystems around the globe. This road through a loblolly pine forest is normally high and dry, but last Sunday it was under a foot of water. And the reason? Sea level rise is very real. If you say, well, the Chesapeake Bay only rose an inch or two, and half of it is sea level rise and half of it is earth subsidence. Well, it's a big deal when a nor'easter goes up the Chesapeake Bay because it's not blowing the normal amount of water, but 1 to 2 inches more water. And that goes on top of another group and another group. And then you end up with a road that you're water skiing on. That's a really cool picture though, isn't it? And another example I like to give is periwinkle snails. They climb up and down salt marsh grass by the tides to survive. But what happens to the snails when the tip of the grass is constantly submerged? You say, well, they'll just move to a place where the marsh is. Well, if we have houses and bulkheads and higher elevations, there's no place for that marsh to march off to. And it can have long lasting effects. Another example that I'm familiar with is that we have birds that nest at a particular altitude, and they're found like, say, between 3,000 and 6,000 feet. That's where they nest. That's the temperature and the weather that they're used to. And the earth gets warmer. And the 3,000 to 6,000 isn't as cool as it used to be. So they move a little bit farther up the mountain. But eventually, if this continues, they're going to get to a part of the mountain where there isn't the temperatures they need. And they just can't go higher. They can't nest in the air. So look at these different environmental organizations, and there's so many more. What are the environmental groups doing to advocate for the environment? Is it time to unite and apply pressure for our nation for a healthy natural ecosystems? Because you know there are a lot of people that are lobbying for other interests that are counter to what we would like. That's the end of my program, except to say that the bird photos were mostly by me, and two of them, one of them right here, was Natalie Martin.
Does anybody have a question they'd like to unmute and just ask Larry?
Hey, I have lots of questions, and thank you for such a wonderful and also extremely timely seminar. The right information at the exact right time. I related to so much of what you were saying. Now, I just moved into a new house here. I love it. I'm in North Durham, and I bought the house from a woman who clearly loved native plants, and it's wonderful. She has, baptisia and lots of wonderful things. And I'm an acolyte, when it comes to somebody like Doug Ptolemy. Also in this garden, though, there are a number of plants that are not natives. And I'm wondering, some of them are very established. For example, I would never ever think to plant a crepe myrtle no more than I would a Bradford pear, when you could plant just an oak tree or a maple. There's so many natives that could go in there, but there is a large and established crepe myrtle.
Mhm.
Now, should I leave that in or should I take that out and put in a native plant?
That's a
And
great question.
There's a
And let me
hedge.
answer that one, and we'll go on to any other ones you have.
Okay,
The thing I always advise people is three things when they're asking about native plants. The
Mhm.
first one is look around your yard. Where would you want to put a native tree? Because you want to plant it right away because trees take a long time.
Mhm.
Number two, if you have a plant that isn't doing well or you don't like anymore that's non-native, then look up, go to the NC Audubon database and find plants that you would like to put there. In other words, when you're replacing plants, replace them with native plants.
Right.
As for the crepe myrtle, I'm not too upset about crepe myrtles because they don't spread too quickly.
Okay.
But there was another plant you mentioned, Bradford pear.
Yeah.
I would always get rid of a Bradford pear because
that's also- it's a
they were
soft
touted
wood.
as they were brought into the country as supposed to be sterile, and they're
Okay.
obviously not. And they're not native, and there's not a lot of the only thing that native animals, birds in particular, do is they'll eat the pears and then spread the pears.
Yeah.
And if in the early spring, when you're going down a highway, you can see where they've spread. So
Yeah.
if you had a
yeah.
Bradford pear, I'd say take it out, take it out. But if you have a crepe myrtle that isn't highly, spreadable, I would say if you love it and it's there, it has some value. I'm not anti every exotic, but when you have a choice, I always would pick the native over the non-native.
You can see the difference. The milkweed, I just literally stood there and watched, because I had grown a lot of milkweed in pots, so I would have it to plant when I got to the house.
Mhm.
And some of them, like the Gomphocarpus and everything, it was originally 7 feet tall. They're great, but I have a hedge. There's a large hedge of Elaeagnus, which is a member of the olive family. It smells very sweet, but I don't know if it's a native or not. Now I know it's providing shelter, a lot of shelter, and I don't know if I would be doing more damage if it's non-native, more damage by taking it out and then waiting for another hedge to grow back to provide more shelter in the way that only a hedge can, or if I'd be better to leave it. I honestly am trying to figure out the best things to do. Or another one that I love, is Oregon grape not a native?
I don't
Yes,
know.
it's not a native. It's native in Oregon, but
But not here.
not here.
Yeah.
And the Elaeagnus is very invasive, so I would remove that. I
Yeah.
think that's where you come into the questions that Larry was asking. If it's on the invasive list,
Take
you
it
should
out.
remove it. If it's,
Got it.
and I think the other thing that Larry talked about earlier was the Doug Tallamy's chart of your percentage of natives versus non-natives. So,
Right.
if your yard was nothing but crepe myrtles, then you'd want to diversify, but it sounds like you have lots of other natives. So to have a few non-natives that are not invasive
Uh-huh.
doesn't impact you greatly. It's so percentage wise, you look at, and I don't know if you count that by plant or by volume or by area,
Yeah.
surface area, but
Well, actually, Doug Ptolemy talks about how to figure it out, the percentages with his project, bringing national parks home or something. Do you
Right.
know what I need? The thing I'm talking about yeah, you can actually register. It's called something like, what is it called?
homegrown national park.
Yes, Homegrown National Park.
There's a lot of things we need to do, but one of the ones is native plants, getting more and more native plants in. Like, for example, the example I gave of my beauty berries being stripped
Yeah.
just as soon as they're ready. And you look at other places and they're not being stripped. I think it's because in my yard, in my community, not my yard, there aren't a lot of native foods. And so they're not getting anything from boxwood or loropetalum or,
Yeah.
any of those Leland cypress or anything. Well, they do nest in Leland cypress, but you need to, think about it this way. Right now, there are some birds coming down from the north, and they've been working really hard, and their fat reserves are just about done. And they drop down here, and they're resting for the night, and they want to refuel in the morning. Look around your neighborhood. Is there a place they can refuel? Because birds, there's a lot of migrant birds that have two places they live, but they also need to be able to go from, say, northern Canada to Nicaragua and find places on a regular basis where they can refuel. I always, when I'm talking to like middle schoolers, I'll say, pretend that you're going from North Carolina to Florida, and there are no McDonald's between the two spots. And they all go, oh, And the idea is that you want to put out your golden arches for those birds when they come down. And it doesn't always have to be something that the bird eats off the bush. They might be eating the insects that are eating the bush. And it works out. Oh, and for the blue jay, go to the NC Audubon database and say, I want to attract blue jays. And it'll say, put these plants out. Remember that they want to have plants that they can hide, they can nest, and they can feed. And it doesn't always have to be the berries, fruits, nuts, or nectar. It could also be the insects that are coming to be attracted. An easy rule of thumb to figure out if it's probably a native plant, when you go to a nursery, walk around and see where the butterflies, bees, and bugs are. They will swarm to native plants before anything else. But just because they're at a plant doesn't necessarily mean they're native, because sometimes they're going for fast food that doesn't have the hosting ability or the integration into the environment. So what I do is I type in the name of the plant in PlantSnap, and it gives me a quick synopsis, and it'll say native to Asia. And I go, okay, I'm not buying that one.
Right.
But then it'll say, this one is native and what we could do about it. Oh, by the way, I have a question that came up. Somebody texted me. Over at St. Francis, I've been working with a man that wanted to plant a bunch of native plants like mussel tree, serviceberry, red buckeye, red bud, choke cherry. And he has an immediate problem. Maybe you have an answer that I can help him with. We have a deer in the property that's coming and rubbing its rack against these young trees that we put out in the spring and the fall. Does anybody know what we could do to protect the tree against those rubs?
At Prairie Ridge, where they have a lot of deer, this is the Science Museum's eco
Yes.
station in Raleigh. They put wire mesh fencing. They make a ring around the tree. And I know they found that I remember when they first started doing, they did a lot of them, and they found that if they just they got sort of electrical conduit, inexpensive tubing, in other words, to hold the rings in place. And
Yes.
they put them far enough out that this was not just for rubbing, but for browsing too, but to protect the tree. They put them far enough out, and they found they could just attach it loosely to the pole, and then they would be able to lift it up to mow, and then put it back down again. But I think they found it quite effective for both the rubbing and the browsing before the trees got tall enough to be able to be above the deer.
See, one of the things that we did is we invested money in, we got trees that on the average are 6, 7, 8 feet tall. But because they're out in the open, right along the edge of a forest, I think the deer are finding them an easy scratching rack. I noticed it on one of the ones that we put in the spring, but he's panicking. So we're going to probably meet tomorrow or the next day over there and see what we can do. So wire cages, poles to stabilize. The lawn mowing wouldn't be a problem because we planted the trees where we don't mow. But thanks for that suggestion. Anybody else have an additional question?
I do. I'm planning to start finding out how I can not only remove some of the non-natives. I may not be able to remove all of them, but some of them I think I just want to get them out and put in natives. But what should I do with the non-native shrubs and plants that I pull? I don't want to give them to a friend and say, hey, would you like this nice blah, 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 because then they're going to have a non-native in their yard.
Yeah.
So what do I do with them? Do I ask, like, you know, what do they call them? The stumper. I love stumpers. They come in, they stump it out, and then you get all that nice stumpy soil. But should I have them stumped? Should I ask somebody to like sort of put them through a wood chipper?
That would work. That would work. A lot of people have a form of a simple chipper at home. I have a chipper shredder that I brought down from Maryland, and I use it to chip and shred the maples in the front yard, the only place I keep grass. And I use it in my native plant gardens over at the church. And I have several native plant gardens that my friends have gotten native plants, and I'll give them a couple bags to use as cover during the winter. And that allows the native plants to have a nice head start in the spring, and they're not competing with weeds. Those of you that maintain native plant gardens, one of the things that I sell native plant gardens on is once you get it started, there's very little weeding after the first or second year. You don't need to water them. And when there's extremes like really hot weather, really dry weather, or really wet weather, these are natives. They've seen that before, and they are very, very hardy.
They are.
Yeah.
Oh, I have another question. Okay, I'm a fan of coneflower, you know, purpura and alba, whatever. But I see all of these other coneflowers like hot papaya and mango and stuff like this. And they just look like they're trying to turn them into some kind of zinnia on steroids or something. But can they help, or might they even be harming the native insects, the native fauna that would go towards a regular, you know, localized purple coneflower if somebody were to put in all the wild hybrids?
I don't know
And that's
specifics
true.
on that.
And that's
Does
true
somebody
for-
here have an opinion based on some information they have? See, that's a good question.
I recently attended a walk by Debbie Roos, who does the Chatham Mills pollinator gardens. And she was basically saying is the jury's out. There's been not enough study, that we don't really know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yeah. And see, a lot of it has to do with like spice bush. Spice bush put out berries in the fall that are excellent. They're the best food you can get for a migrating bird. They're really high fat content. So if you got a cultivar of spice bush, is it going to be the exact same, you know, quality berry? That's the question.
Right.
You know,
Right.
how
That's
well it's
exactly right.
connected.
Will it provide exactly that? It could be one tiny little piece of a gene, but
Yeah.
will that, they're cultivating them to a, you know, sort of a, like an amuse bouche or something, like, oh, look at that one, it has feathers.
Yeah.
But does it provide the same benefit as the original specimen, you know, specimen plants or whatever?
Right. Right. And like I know for a fact that swamp milkweed, if you get the native variety, it's much more hardy than one of the ones that is showier. And so if I can, well, not if I can, I just do. I always try to get the native.
I want to follow up on the question about cultivars. I think that I remember years ago when I was doing a native plant garden for the North Carolina Wildlife not Federation, but the one in Raleigh, they were doing school gardens, school education gardens. And the wildlife people were telling me that the berries, for instance, on the winterberry, on some of the cultivars that we have been selected for large berries because they look good to people. But that the birds that eat them don't like them as much as the small berries because they're too big to get in their mouths. And so there are things, we tend to think of things from our perspective, and I think
like a bird.
Linda had asked me a few days ago about purple redbuds, that there's been reference, I think that may have been Doug Tellme, but talking about how purple leaf plants, the caterpillars don't necessarily, they're not used to those plants being purple, or the things that eat the caterpillars aren't used to those plants being purple, so that they're not as popular. And of course, we tend to choose plants that don't have bugs on them, but
Yeah,
the bugs are very important. And so,
absolutely.
so I think that there are, I think that it seems like if it's just for size or something like that, a smaller Joe Pye weed, but the flower's the same, I don't think that's as much of an issue with cultivars. But when they start changing the colors or changing the sizes of fruit and things like that, it does have effects on the creatures that are eating them. So again, another reason to stick with the straight species sometimes. I want to follow up on the question about cultivars. I think that I remember years ago when I was doing a native plant garden for the North Carolina Wildlife, not Federation, but the one in Raleigh, they were doing school gardens, school education gardens. And the wildlife people were telling me that the berries, for instance, on the winterberry, on some of the cultivars that we have been selected for large berries because they look good to people. But that the birds that eat them don't like them as much as the small berries because they're too big to get in their mouths. And so there are things, we tend to think of things from our perspective, and I think
like a bird.
Linda had asked me a few days ago about purple redbuds, that there's been reference, I think that may have been Doug Tellme, but talking about how purple leaf plants, the caterpillars don't necessarily, they're not used to those plants being purple, or the things that eat the caterpillars aren't used to those plants being purple, so that they're not as popular. And of course, we tend to choose plants that don't have bugs on them, but
Yeah,
the bugs are very important. And
absolutely.
so I think that there are, I think that it seems like if it's just for size or something like that, a smaller Joe Pye weed, but the flower's the same, I don't think that's as much of an issue with cultivars. But when they start changing the colors or changing the sizes of fruit and things like that, it does have effects on the creatures that are eating them. So again, another reason to stick with the straight species sometimes. You were talking about climate change. I was thinking another thing that's been brought up a lot now of being a concern for birds is that the birds' migration has been timed to relate to when native fruits are fruiting, and that when they get there and they've already finished, or they haven't started, or they bloomed too early, or whatever, it really contributes to the starvation because they're no longer in sync.
Yeah.
And it takes a while for the intuition to adjust to climate change.
Well, an example I have is bird related, but it's a plant. When I was teaching, my last couple of years, I taught middle school, and at our middle school, we raised a lot of native submerged aquatic vegetation, seaweed, for replanting in the bay. And we got really good at it. I mean, amazingly good. In fact, so good that we were running out of open space for trays with these seaweed. But the problem we had is that when we would put them in these streams where they historically had been, there were mute swans there. And mute swans eat 14 pounds of submerged aquatic vegetation a day, and they don't migrate. Whereas the tundra swan come down in mid-November and leave by early February. So they can only eat so much. But the mute swans were there just eating it. So see, what we had to do was look at the bigger picture and say, mute swans are a problem. They're a problem for tundra swan. They're a problem for submerged aquatic vegetation. And if submerged aquatic vegetation disappears, there are a lot of crabs and minnows and shrimp that depend on those grass beds. And so the state of Maryland got a permit to try to remove mute swans. And that's exactly what they did. By the way, if you ever are on Facebook and you want to friend me, Lawrence Zollar, I run a Facebook page where almost every day I put out 4 pictures of things I saw in nature that day. And I keep it really simple. And if you want a nature moment of Zen, friend me and you'll see what I'm talking about. No controversy, just a raccoon, a salamander, a millstone, and a great blue heron. And it's just kind of fun. And I figure if I get enough people seeing my Facebook page, I'm going to hit one of those expensive binocular companies to sponsor me. Yeah, like that'll happen. Hey, I appreciate you all inviting me. If you would email your directors on any glaring errors you saw in the presentation, you say, oh, that's not true, or that's not the bird, or that's not the insect, or that's not the plant, or some kind of suggestion that has to do with the program. This is the first time I did it. I hope you can't see that it was too stilting, but I'd like to improve it because I will use it again with garden clubs, the regional libraries, different groups that want to talk. In fact, if any of you guys want to talk, we have ones on bird feeders, ones on birds of Wake County, the fall and winter birds of Wake County. We have a lot of different talks that are a nice way to raise your bird IQ. Well, is that it?
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah. Thank you for
That was
inviting
fun.
me.
That was wonderful.
It was
Okay.
great.
And
Thank you
remember to
so
send me
much.
the recording because I have a couple of friends that like to see it on YouTube.
Okay. I will.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. This has been great.